Hi, I'm Jamin Pelkey, coming to you from the Toronto area of Ontario, Canada. And coming to you also with a background in linguistics and semiotics to talk to you about natural propositions in bat chatter. Recent evidence for simplex, mirror, and single scope blends. My appreciation to Mark for the excellent introduction to this panel, and basically my purpose in this talk is to follow up on his mandate that we should have a research program investigating rudimentary blending in non-human animals. Now, to make a distinction between rudimentary blending and double scope or complex or vortex blends is necessarily to assume some kind of basic distinction, division, or typology, or so it would seem. It is worth noting that Falconet and Turner in 2002 do set out to define a basic typology, in spite of the fact that there are multiple possibilities for compression and decompression, different connections, different kinds of projection and emergence, plus the richness of the world that allows for a vast array of possible kinds of integration network. Amid this diversity, they originally noted simplex, mirror, single scope, and double scope blends as being particularly salient, standing out against the background of other possibilities, while also, of course, recognizing that these types or modes are necessarily integrated. They point out that the network model predicts their existence from theoretical principles, and indeed, when we look at the laboratory of nature, we find very strong evidence that they really exist. Turner, in his later updates of the theory in 2014, notes that blending is flexible, systematic, and principled, but it can produce many different kinds or many different blending webs. They don't separate into just a few kinds. There's no taxonomy or partition. Still, certain general patterns of blending arise so often that they've been given names. These four names, simplex, mirror, single scope, double scope, are not a strict hierarchy, but just as it's helpful for us to pick out red along a spectrum, or green, or blue, it can be helpful to pick out these modes of blending as activities, especially for our purposes, in order to come to a better understanding of the nature of language, an enhanced capacity for interspecies solidarity, as my colleague Yogi Henlon likes to say, and in the process to resituate human language within its substrate of animal communication. I'm especially interested in this talk in exploring the nature of simplex blends. So, simplex blends are compositional role value assignments, or they involve these kinds of role value assignments with vital relation framing and truth functional framing. So to say in human language, Paul is the father of Sally, is to rely on or activate a simplex blend. The more basic template that this implies is this is the blank of that, or X is the Y of Z. Or in Phrygian predicate calculus, as Falconet and Turner point out, FAB in this particular notation. At a more general level, a semiotic level, a level that is pre-linguistic or extra-linguistic, that doesn't require human language, any mode of cognition that involves an activity of type token matching is a simplex blend. This is a particularly important point to note. When trying to map this onto recent theory of Friedrich Sternfeld in biosemiotics called natural propositions. Natural propositions occur whenever some object is judged to be of a specific type, without expressing it in language necessarily. So if what are involved in this process are perceptual symbols, to use a term from Barcelona, These perceptual symbols can occur in propositions outside of language, in perceptual judgments when some object is judged to be of a specific type. We'll come back to to Sternfeldt's development of Charles Sanders Peirce's concept of the Dicey sign, which Sternfeldt talks about as natural propositions at the end of the paper. For now, let's dig into three recent studies on bat chatter that reveal it to be much more complex and interesting than had originally been assumed. I will argue especially for the existence, or activation, I should say, of simplex modes of blending in these three studies of bat chatter, but possibly also evidence for mirror modes and single-scope modes of blending as well. The three studies are everyday bat vocalizations, contain information about the emitter-addressee context and behavior from Pratt et al. 2016. Also a Pratt et al. 2017 work from the same lab, looking into Egyptian fruit bat communication out of Tel Aviv University. In Israel, crowd vocal learning induces vocal dialects in bats, playback of conspecific shapes, fundamental frequency usage by pups, and then a study in 2020 by Fernandez-Nornschild, pup-directed vocalizations of adult females and males in a vocal learning bat, this particular bat being a greater sackwing bat in a different part of the world, Central and South America. First of all, let's look at the development of what researchers have come to call chatter dialects. We have evidence in both Egyptian fruit bats and greater sackwing bats. I'll argue that this gives us evidence of simplex blending, type token pattern matching. Pratt et al. Note that they found that their pups they studied presented a crowd vocal learning phenomenon, where their vocal repertoire was shaped by the complete repertoire they heard in their colony, mainly governed by their playbacks, and not only by the vocalizations of a single tutor or their parents. So this level of mimicry is more complex. Instead of simply being guided by parent-directed communication, which itself could result in simplex blends, the bats in these three separate controls were given samples of different ranges of frequencies taken from a much larger corpus of recordings, and including high frequencies, a high frequency group, a low frequency group, and a medium frequency group. And in all three cases, with statistically significant results, the learning process favored a kind of pattern matching across the group by the 5 conspecifics that were placed in the cave to listen to the recording. Similarly, but in quite a different context with greater sackwing bats, during the ontogenetic period when pups' isolation calls, which are used to solicit maternal care, are converging toward each other to form a group signature, adult males also produced isolation calls, and the pups' isolation calls were demonstrated to be acoustically more similar to those of males from the same social group than to other males from other social groups. So in both of these cases, we have a kind of rudimentary blend. We have evidence for rudimentary blending mode, which involves a kind of pattern matching with truth functional framing and role value assignment. In this case, the role value, depending on perspective, could shift between parent and pup-directed communication, or the pup listening to the larger group, or the pup listening to males' isolation calls and mimicking the ones in their group versus the other. So we also find simplex blends in female use of baby talk. Baby talk in humans is also known as motherese, whenever mother or other caregivers speaks with a modulated pitch and timbre and slows the rate of delivery for the child in child-directed speech, something like, "Do you see the cow? What does the cow say?" The same kind of phenomenon happens in greater sac-wing bats when females modulate timbre, pitch, and rate of an otherwise directly analogous communication when they're specifically directing the communication toward their pups. And this is demonstrated across 6 different linear frequency septral coefficients, suggesting that pup-directed vocalizations have different acoustic properties. This seems like a candidate for mirror blending, but it's also important to note strong evidence for simplex blending due to the pattern matching, type token pattern matching that we also see in this example. And then the possibility for single scope blends, or whatever mode of blending this is, it's more complex than had been realized to exist among bats in this 2016 study among Egyptian fruit bats, where social vocalizations of fruit bats were demonstrated to contain multi-layered information. The signature of the emitter being there, but also the identity of the addressee, and also information about the context itself, including a 4-way potential distinction between feeding versus mating versus perch versus sleep. Now, all of these are agonistic indexes, but instead of just being a general agonistic index, there's specificity. And the specificity is encoded at 4 levels of distinction in addition to the distinctions between emitter and addressee. In single scope blending, we have 2 input mental spaces that have strong conflicts in their organizing structure, but one of them controls the organization of the blend. Is this mode of cognition and communication in fruit bats an example of single scope blending? Regardless of whether or not it is, it definitely includes multiple layers of simplex blending modes. Simplex blends, I noted, are the real focus of this presentation. Let me give some other examples. Clearly, when a robin selects a fine strand of grass for its nest, simplex blending is involved. When a pet gerbil rejects a hay pellet but accepts a sunflower seed, as my daughter's pet gerbils do, we have simplex blending. When a crow remembers the face of a human antagonist, or a female baboon prefers a male who doesn't beat her up, or a group of baboons learns to distinguish between a dart gun and a walking stick, as reported by Sapolsky. We have compositional role value assignment with vital relation and truth functional framing, which we could also identify with Sternfeld as natural propositions, when some object is judged to be of a specific type without necessarily expressing it in language. Yes, we can do this in language. When we do this in language, we're also doing something that's more complex. But at a more basic level, allo animals, non-human animals, are doing the same kind of type token matching constantly. And we need to recognize this. In order to recognize it, we also have to recognize that propositions, these natural propositions, are more basic than the perceptual symbols that they involve or entail. This assumes that we're working with Charles Sanders Peirce's understanding of what a proposition is, though. What is a proposition according to Charles Sanders Peirce? It's a digisign that is a symbol. So he likes to give the example of a person's portrait with their name written under it, which is strictly a proposition, although its syntax is not that of speech. These propositions involve perceptual symbols, and these perceptual symbols require us to move along with Sternfeld toward a vast redefinition of the whole field of cognition, perception, signs, language, and thought. It's a grand challenge that would require us to recognize as well that feature abstraction in biology is much simpler and more widespread than full, rich, detailed perception. So that the issue, Sternfeld says, is not so much that of finding out how to come from perception to abstraction, it is rather how to come during evolution from abstraction to perception. If we do this, Sternfeld argues, we come to see that the natural habitat of perceptual symbols is their appearance in propositions, or simplex blends. This natural habitat is necessarily connected with something else that biosemioticians developing the thought of Jakob von Uexküll call Umwelt cognition. But my colleagues in the next talk are going to deal with Umwelt cognition, and so for now I simply say thank you and turn the floor over to them.